They need us more than we need them. That was the phrase. That was the gamble. That was the logic that led to what might become the single most catastrophic economic miscalculation in modern American history. For decades, there's been this quiet arrogance floating through Washington, a belief that Canada is essentially the attic of the United States, a friendly, snow-covered storage facility where we keep spare resources until we're ready to use them, a 51st state in everything but official paperwork. The assumption was beautifully simple and utterly wrong. America holds the cards. America has the consumer market. America has the military might. If things got tense, Canada would fold like a cheap lawn chair. Well, as of this morning, Sunday, January 25th, 2026, we're finding out exactly what happens when the perpetually polite neighbour finally reaches their breaking point. 48 hours ago, President Trump signed Executive Order 109, slapping a blanket 25% tariff on all Canadian imports. Everything. Energy, lumber, aluminum, the works. The stated goal was forcing Ottawa to renegotiate the USMCA on terms that would essentially hand over their sovereignty over natural resources. The White House War Room was expecting a delegation of apologetic Canadians to show up in D.C., hats literally in hand, begging for exemptions and waivers. That's not what happened. In a move that absolutely no analyst on Wall Street had priced into their models, Prime Minister Trudeau, or perhaps his successor driven by a suddenly unified parliament, didn't just issue counter-tariffs. He invoked the National Strategic Reserve Act. He didn't tax the exports. He banned them completely. Right now, as you're watching this, the valves on the Enbridge main line are closing. The freight trains carrying potash fertilizer to the American Midwest are stopping dead at the border. Uranium shipments destined for nuclear power plants across the United States have been grounded indefinitely. And the American economy isn't just catching a cold, it's going into full cardiac arrest. Gas prices in the Midwest jumped 80 cents overnight. The Chicago Board of Trade had to suspend trading on wheat futures because the fertilizer panic became so severe they couldn't establish a rational price floor. The U.S. Department of Energy just issued a red alert for the Texas power grid, not because of weather, but because the refineries that feed that grid are literally starving for crude. In this deep dive, we're going to expose the fundamental lie of energy independence. We're going to show you why the United States is chemically, geologically, and strategically addicted to Canada in ways that go far beyond friendly neighbour relations. We're going to break down 3 specific commodities, heavy crude oil, uranium, and potash, that are about to bring the world's largest economy to its knees. This isn't a trade war in the traditional sense. This is an economic siege. And for the first time in American history, we're on the let's start with the map, because to understand the sheer panic rippling through the White House Situation Room right now, you need to understand the chemistry of oil. We've been told for a decade that the United States is energy independent. We frack the Permian Basin in Texas. We pump millions of barrels of crude every single day. We export oil to countries around the world. So logically, why does it matter if Canada cuts us off? Here's the dirty secret that nobody in the energy sector talks about publicly. It's called the mismatch problem. The oil that comes gushing out of the ground in Texas and North Dakota is what's called light sweet crude. It's thin, almost like water, and it's low in sulfur content. On paper, it's great stuff. High-quality petroleum. But here's where the entire narrative falls apart. The massive refinery complexes along the Gulf Coast, the industrial behemoths that produce your diesel fuel, your jet fuel, and your gasoline, were not engineered to process light sweet crude. They were built in the 1990s and 2000s specifically to handle heavy sour crude. This is the thick, sludge-like oil that traditionally came from Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. These refineries are like enormously complex digestive systems. They invested billions of dollars into cokers and crackers, specialized equipment designed to break down heavy petroleum sludge. If you try feeding these refineries nothing but light Texas oil, they don't just work less efficiently. They actually malfunction. They run at maybe 60% capacity. They can't produce enough diesel to meet demand. The entire system starts breaking down from the inside. For the last 5 years, ever since sanctions cut off Venezuelan supply and production collapsed in Mexico, The US refining system has had exactly one reliable lifeline keeping it functional: Canadian oil sands. Canada sends nearly 4 million barrels of this heavy crude south every single day. It flows through the operational sections of the Keystone Pipeline, the Enbridge Mainline, and by railcar. It's the blood flowing through the veins of the US industrial machine. When the president slapped tariffs on Canadian energy, the administration thought they were taxing a competitor. What they actually did was tax their own supply chain. But Canada didn't just accept the tariff and pass the cost along. They played what strategists are now calling the China card. For years, the United States actively blocked pipeline projects like Keystone XL because energy planners understood it trapped Canadian oil inside the North American market. If Canada can't physically pipe their oil to coastal ports, they have no choice but to sell it to American refineries at a significant discount. It's called the WCS discount, Western Canadian Select Pricing. That discount structure has saved American drivers billions of dollars annually. But last year, something fundamental changed. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion finally opened fully. Canada now has direct pipeline access to the Pacific Ocean. Yesterday, the Canadian Energy Minister stood in front of cameras and announced a strategic partnership with CNPC, the Chinese state oil giant. They've committed to purchasing every single barrel of heavy crude that American refineries reject. Oil tankers are already forming lines in Vancouver Harbour. So what happens to the Midwest? The region that energy analysts call the PADD2 district depends on Canadian oil for roughly 70% of its refinery feedstock. 70%. Without that specific grade of oil, the refineries in Illinois, Ohio, and Minnesota have to shut down operations completely. You can't just ship Texas light crude up there overnight. The pipeline infrastructure doesn't exist. The entire system was built to move oil north to south, or west to east, not the reverse. We're looking at a scenario where gas stations in Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis could run completely dry within 72 hours. Not higher prices. No gasoline available at any price. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which gets mentioned constantly in these discussions, is mostly filled with medium sour crude. It can help temporarily, but it physically cannot replace 4 million barrels per day of a specific heavy grade. And even if it could somehow match the chemistry, the SPR storage facilities are located in the Gulf Coast, not the Midwest. The infrastructure to move it doesn't exist at that scale. The arrogance embedded in the phrase "we don't need Canada" completely ignored the physical reality shown on every pipeline map. We built a continent-wide energy machine over decades, operating on the assumption that the border was essentially imaginary. Now that the border has become an actual wall, the machine is broken. Political chess exists to bring you these analyses that cut through the surface-level narratives you get from conventional news sources. Every video here is built on hours of research, cross-referencing data streams, and applying a critical lens that goes beyond the obvious talking points. If that approach resonates with you, drop a comment below telling me which specific aspect of this crisis you want me to dig deeper into for the next video. If you think the gas lines forming in the Midwest are catastrophic, wait until you see what's about to happen to your electric bill. The United States generates roughly 20% of its electricity from nuclear power plants. That's the baseload power. It's what keeps the lights on when wind turbines aren't spinning and solar panels are dark. But here's a fact that should terrify anyone paying attention. The United States produces almost zero uranium domestically. We import 95% of the enriched fuel that powers our reactor fleet. Where did that uranium come from historically? Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. But in 2024, Congress passed legislation banning Russian uranium imports as part of the sanctions package targeting Putin's regime. That decision left the United States with exactly one reliable, secure, massive supplier: Canada. The Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan is essentially the Saudi Arabia of uranium. The Cigar Lake and MacArthur River mining operations produce the highest grade uranium ore found anywhere on Earth. Cameco, when this trade war erupted, the White House assumed nuclear fuel would obviously be exempt from any retaliation. Strategic materials, national security, all that. It wasn't exempt. In a move that reportedly shocked officials at the Pentagon, Ottawa formally designated uranium a critical national security asset. They've paused all export licenses to the United States pending what they're calling a comprehensive security review. This is checkmate in slow motion. Nuclear power plants operate on fuel cycles that last 18 to 24 months. They don't stockpile years' worth of fuel rods sitting in warehouse parking lots. Some plants are scheduled for refueling this spring. If they don't receive those fuel bundles on schedule, they have to power down completely. If we lose 20% of our grid capacity right as summer heat approaches, we're looking at rolling blackouts cascading across the eastern seaboard. And unlike oil, where you can theoretically buy extra barrels on spot markets, uranium doesn't work that way. It has to be mined, milled, converted, enriched, and fabricated into fuel assemblies. That supply chain takes years to establish. Canada knows this. They understand completely that without their yellowcake uranium, the US Navy's nuclear aircraft carriers don't sail, and the lights in Washington, D.C. go dark. This is the quiet leverage that nobody talks about in public forums. Canada doesn't brag about military strength, but they literally hold the keys to ours. The Department of Energy is currently scrambling to identify alternative suppliers in Australia and Namibia, but the logistics infrastructure isn't there. The contracts aren't signed. And here's the kicker. Guess which country has been systematically buying up African uranium supply? China. By pushing Canada into a corner, we've created a scenario where they might sell this strategic asset to our primary geopolitical adversary. Imagine Chinese nuclear reactors powered by Canadian uranium, while American reactors sit cold and dark because of a dispute that started over lumber tariffs. It's strategic suicide playing out in real time. Energy keeps us moving. Uranium keeps the lights on. But this next commodity, this one literally keeps us alive. Let's talk about potash. It's a pink crystalline salt. You've probably never thought about it consciously, but if you eat food grown on industrial farms, your life depends on it. Potash is the K in NPK fertilizer. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You cannot grow corn, soybeans, or wheat at industrial scales without potassium. The plants grow weak, they don't yield properly. The food supply collapses. The world has exactly three main sources of potash: Russia and Belarus, both heavily sanctioned and logistically difficult to ship from; Canada, specifically Saskatchewan; and everyone else combined produces tiny amounts. Saskatchewan alone produces nearly 1/3 of the entire world's supply. But more critically for American farmers, it supplies. When Trump signed that executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all Canadian minerals, he effectively placed a 25% tax on every single bushel of corn that will be grown in America this year. But Canada didn't just let American farmers absorb that tax and move on. They stopped the trains. The Premier of Saskatchewan, acting in direct coordination with the Prime Minister's office, cited supply chain instability and immediately halted all rail shipments heading south across the border. We are now just weeks away from the critical spring planting season. Farmers across the Corn Belt are sitting on their tractors, staring at empty storage barns, waiting for fertilizer that isn't coming. They need that potash in the ground by April. If they miss the planting window, there is no corn crop in October. If Canada keeps the potash north of the border for just 30 days, we miss that window completely. Agricultural analysts are projecting yield drops of 30 to 40%. Do you understand what that does to food prices? Corn feeds the cattle. Soybeans feed the chickens. The price of beef, chicken, milk, eggs, and bread will double, maybe triple. This is what economists are already calling the breakfast tax, and it's entirely self-inflicted. We're already seeing Big Mac index futures spiking in commodity markets. Financial analysts are seriously predicting a $15 Big Mac by July if this standoff isn't resolved. Meanwhile, Canada has a bumper crop lined up. They have all the fertilizer they could possibly need. They can sell their surplus food production to the world at record prices while American farmers file for bankruptcy. The irony is almost unbearable. The tariffs were supposedly designed to save the American farmer from unfair foreign competition. Instead, they're depriving American farmers of the one critical input they absolutely need to compete at all. If you've made it this far into the video, it's because this kind of analysis actually means something to you. And look, political chess is going to keep bringing this level of depth to every topic we cover. Subscribing is the simplest way to make sure these videos keep reaching you. This isn't about chasing numbers. It's about building a community that thinks differently and sees through the surface narrative. For a century, the United States and Canada have functioned like a long-married couple. We bicker occasionally, but we sleep in the same bed and share the same house. The foundational assumption in Washington policy circles was that Canada has nowhere else to go. They're geographically locked to the United States. They share our culture and language. They're trapped in our economic orbit. That assumption might have been accurate in 1990. It is demonstrably false in 2026. This morning, the Canadian Trade Minister announced what they're calling the Pacific Gateway Initiative. Ottawa is slashing regulatory requirements to fast-track LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas export facilities, on the West Coast. They're accelerating critical mineral exports to Japan, South Korea, and explicitly, China. A report published by RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada, describes it as the dependency trap exit strategy. Canada is publicly acknowledging that being 70% dependent on the United States for trade represents a fundamental national security risk. They're willing to endure a short-term recession to break. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. The United States relies on Canada for NORAD operations. The radar installations that detect Russian missiles coming over the Arctic are physically located on Canadian sovereign territory. We rely on Canadian aluminum to manufacture F-35 fighter jets. Canada provides roughly 70% of all aluminum imports into the United States. We rely on Canadian steel for armoured vehicles. If Canada decides to adopt a position of strategic neutrality in trade disputes, if they announce they'll trade equally with all nations, suddenly the US defense industrial base has a critical vulnerability that cannot be easily fixed. We can't build advanced fighter jets without their aluminum. We can't fly those jets without their fuel. We can't detect incoming missile threats without access to their land. The USMCA Free Trade Agreement is effectively suspended at this point. We've regressed to 1930s-style protectionism. But in the 1930s, the United States was genuinely self-sufficient in raw materials. In 2026, the United States is a hyper-specialized economy that requires constant imports of basic resources. And we just declared economic war on our primary supplier. This is the type of content that doesn't surface in algorithmic feeds by accident. It appears because people like you watch to the end, leave comments and share it with others. Every time you send this video to someone, you're helping spread a fundamentally different way of understanding what's actually happening in the world. So how does this crisis actually end? It ends with a phone call. It ends with the President of the United States picking up the secure line, calling Ottawa directly, and blinking. Because the mathematics are undeniable at this point, we can hurt Canada economically. We can crush their GDP growth, we can trigger a recession in Toronto. But Canada can stop our cars from running. They can starve our crops. They can turn off our lights. The pain tolerance of a resource-rich nation will always exceed the pain tolerance of a consumer-rich nation. Canadians can burn wood to stay warm and eat their own wheat. Americans cannot eat iPhones or stream Netflix to survive. This trade war has brutally exposed the fragility at the core of American power projection. We expanded our influence globally across every continent, but we forgot to secure our own backyard. We treated our closest ally like a subordinate vassal state, and now we're discovering the price of that arrogance. The entire We Don't Need Canada movement was a bluff built on faulty assumptions. Canada just called that bluff. As markets open Monday morning, keep your attention focused on three specific ticker symbols. Cameco, trading as CCJ for uranium exposure. Nutrien, trading as NTR for potash and fertilizer. And ExxonMobil, XOM, for refining margin pressure. If those stocks are moving dramatically, the crisis is deepening in real time. We'll likely see a temporary exemption announcement from the White House within 48 hours. They'll frame it as a goodwill gesture, diplomatic progress, cooling tensions. But everyone paying attention will know the actual truth. They looked at the empty gas tanks forming lines in the Midwest, and they realized that in 2026, geography hasn't changed. Geography is still destiny, and we're permanently stuck with each other whether we like it or not. Let's go deeper into the aluminum crisis, because this is the specific trigger point that genuinely terrifies US military planners. The headlines always focus on oil and gas, but the invisible crisis unfolding right now is metal. Aluminum is essentially congealed electricity in solid form. To produce it, you need bauxite ore and absolutely massive amounts of cheap electrical power to run the smelting facilities. Canada has Quebec. Quebec has hydroelectric dams everywhere. It's the perfect aluminum factory. Alcoa and Rio Tinto operate enormous smelters north of the border that feed directly into the US manufacturing sector. Ford F-150 trucks, Tesla chassis frames, Boeing aircraft fuselages, SpaceX rocket bodies, and the armor plating on Bradley fighting vehicles all depend on Canadian aluminum. The United States produces a tiny fraction of the aluminum it actually consumes. Our electricity costs are too high. We shut down our domestic smelters decades ago because they couldn't compete. When these tariffs hit, the just-in-time supply chain model that the entire auto industry runs on completely snapped. Ford operates manufacturing plants in both Oakville, Canada, and Detroit, United States. Individual automotive parts cross the border 7 times on average before a finished car rolls off the assembly line. With a 25% tariff applied at each border crossing, the profit margin doesn't just shrink, it disappears entirely. Ford and General Motors have already announced temporary production line suspensions. This means thousands of auto workers in Michigan, a critical swing state politically, are being sent home without pay. The UAW, United Auto Workers Union, is furious. But they're marching on Washington, not Ottawa. They understand clearly that this trade war is destroying their jobs, not protecting them. But the defense industry angle is significantly scarier than automotive production. The Department of Defense issued a classified report in 2025, portions of which have since leaked, stating explicitly that secure access to Canadian aluminum is a fundamental prerequisite for national defense strategy execution. If we're forced to buy aluminum on open international markets, we're competing directly with China for supply. And Chinese aluminum production is dirty, coal-fired, and increasingly hit with other sanctions and tariffs. We have effectively sanctioned ourselves away from our only clean, secure, high-volume source of the strategic metal we need to build the weapon systems required to fight the next major war. This is the autarky delusion playing out in policy. The belief that America can do everything alone, produce everything domestically, need nothing from anyone. We can't. Not anymore. The supply chains are too deep. The economic integration is too complex. Trying to forcibly untangle the US and Canadian economies is like attempting to separate conjoined twins with a chainsaw. You might technically succeed, but you're going to kill the patient in the process. Political chess is about exactly this. Going beyond the surface level, questioning what appears obvious, and delivering analysis that actually prepares you for what's coming next. This isn't empty entertainment. It's a tool for understanding how power actually works. And finally, let's briefly touch on the third rail issue that nobody wants to discuss publicly. Water, the Great Lakes system. We share them, but Canada controls the northern water flow dynamics. For years, the arid southwestern United States has been quietly eyeing Canadian freshwater resources. There have been schemes proposed to pipe water from Manitoba down to Nevada. Canada has consistently said absolutely not. But in a trade war, that no becomes a weapon. There are treaties governing the flow of the Columbia River. The Columbia River Treaty was up for renegotiation when this crisis started. If Canada decides to maximize reservoir levels on their side for domestic hydropower needs, which is a completely plausible and defensible excuse, the water levels flowing into Washington State and Oregon drop significantly. The Grand Coulee Dam loses generating capacity. The Pacific Northwest, home to massive Amazon and Microsoft data center operations, loses reliable power. Water is the ultimate strategic resource on a warming planet, and Canada controls roughly 20% of the world's accessible freshwater. You can print money when it becomes worthless. You can drill for oil in new places when prices spike. You cannot create water. The Great Lakes aren't just lakes. They're a shared strategic asset that we've taken for granted for generations. That assumption is ending. The pattern is clear across every sector. energy, minerals, metals, food, water. The United States built an economic empire on the assumption that geography had been conquered by technology and military power, that borders were obsolete, that supply chains were infinitely flexible. We're learning in real time that none of those assumptions were true. Geography still matters, borders still matter, and the country that controls physical resources has leverage that financial markets cannot easily replace. This crisis will resolve eventually. Phone calls will be made, deals will be negotiated, the border will reopen to some degree. But the fundamental relationship has changed permanently. Canada has been shown that dependence on the United States is a vulnerability, not a strength. They will diversify. They will build pipelines to the Pacific. They will sign long-term contracts with Asian buyers. And the United States will have lost something that took a century to build and can never be fully recovered. Trust. The assumption that we could push them around because we're bigger, richer, and more powerful has been shattered. They pushed back, and it worked. Every other country watching this crisis is taking notes. If Canada can successfully call America's bluff, who else might try? This is the real cost of the tariff strategy, not the immediate economic pain, though that's severe. The real cost is the message it sends to the world. American power has limits. American threats can be countered. American arrogance has a price. As you watch this situation develop over the coming days and weeks, pay attention not just to the headlines about negotiations and deals. Pay attention to the infrastructure investments Canada announces. Pay attention to which countries they sign new trade agreements with. Pay attention to the long-term strategic shifts that are happening while everyone is distracted by the short-term crisis. That's where the real story is. The world order is shifting beneath our feet, and most people won't even notice until it's already finished. The tariff war of 2026 might end. But the assumptions that made it possible are dead, and we're all living in whatever comes next.